Picture the scene. It's been a long, arduous road to the end. On the battlefield stands our hero, the once bright-eyed underdog who started from nothing. Or maybe they're the anti-hero who discovered the new meaning in their journey. Across from them, their ultimate challenge, their final opponent, the personification of hubris and the corrupt status quo. Or maybe they're just a warped reflection of our protagonist. This is the deciding fight, and during this intense stare down, we take time to reflect on the adventures we've experienced. And all we can do is just wonder, with bated breath, who will throw the first punch. This is a scene we're all familiar with. It's Naruto versus Sasuke, Goku versus literally anyone and anything. Nothing compares to anime when everything comes to a head, and you know there's a hell of a battle coming up. Well, maybe one thing compares to that high, because this setup is also Bret the Hitman Hart versus Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Mr. McMahon, and Dynamite Kid versus Tiger Mask. There's a common thought that professional wrestling is nothing more than an overly dramatic soap opera. And while people are welcome to have that opinion, we think they're a little wide of the mark, because wrestling is anime. If you're the kind of person who's never experienced professional wrestling, you might be surprised to learn that there's a surprising amount of overlap between wrestling fans and anime fans. But maybe this crossover appeal isn't as surprising as it seems. To find out, we'll have to travel back a few decades. Through the late 20th century, anime and pro wrestling were pretty much always there and developing at their own pace. After World War II, wrestlers like Rikidozan were entertaining all manners of Japanese crowds, while various other wrestling promotions all over the world enjoyed their own brand of entertainment. Meanwhile, through the 50s and 60s, Toei Entertainment and Osamu Tezuka's Mushi Productions were well on their way to establishing themselves as pillars of the anime industry. Both mediums slowly gained traction, but it really wasn't until the 80s that you could start to see the convergence of wrestling and anime, particularly in America. And that's all because of a metric rise of a certain anime genre that, like wrestling, involved a bunch of dudes who fight excessively while constantly striving to better themselves. We speak, of course, of the shonen battle genre. In 1980s America, professional wrestling saw an explosion of popularity, causing the golden age of the medium. Midway through the decade, the World Wrestling Federation, now known as World Wrestling Entertainment, would organize the first ever WrestleMania, an annual event that still holds immense weight in wrestling today. It was also perhaps the time that patriotism in wrestling was the most prominent, with many villains being portrayed as the invading foreigner. Most notably people like the Iron Sheik, Nikolai Volkov, and even Sergeant Slaughter when he turned heel in the early 90s and became a Iraqi sympathizer during the lead up to the Gulf War. And that's to say nothing of the talent of the athletes themselves, but this is generally how their characters were presented. But this was also the super patriotic period that was host to the wrestlers that were not only patriotic, but paragons of men. Comparable to superheroes in their own right, people like Macho Man Randy Savage, The Ultimate Warrior, Hulk Hogan, and Curt Hennig, whose nickname was literally Mr. Perfect. Names aside, you can also see a lot of these wrestling stories might have played out. The hometown hero disposing of the others. This was always a theme in wrestling up to this point, even in Rikidozan's days. Many of his stories were framed as the glorious Japanese wrestler defeating the foreign invaders. And anime of the day were tackling similar stories, though the foreign invaders usually took the form of aliens or whatever the hell. The same children that were heeding Hulk Hogan's advice to eat their vitamins and say their prayers were also exposed to a growing number of anime series, like Gatchaman, which became Battle of the Planets in the States, or Space Battleship Yamato, which became Star Blazers in the West. The latter being a story about defending humanity in a modified World War II Battleship Yamato. The real Battleship Yamato itself being recognized as a symbol of Imperial Japanese engineering that would destroy the invading forces. The vehicle to deliver these themes may have been different between anime and wrestling, but the parallels were there. As for the racial stereotyping that ran rampant in wrestling, it isn't as blatant now as it used to be, but these sorts of gimmicks can still be found in modern wrestling. Though many people would be happy to leave these characters behind and focus on interpersonal conflicts and athleticism rather than national identity. And the aforementioned Alien Invasion anime series helped set the stage for the incoming anime explosion of the 80s and 90s in America. Not to mention they paved the way for another certain anime making Kamehameha waves in Japan that would soon make its way to stateside. By the mid to late 90s, the landscape was similar. But also, everything had changed. Dragon Ball has undergone its time skip with Dragon Ball Z premiering in America in 1996, appealing to those who had enjoyed the original series while also putting far more focus on the actual fights, giving the series a slightly more adult feel while still maintaining the familiarity of being Dragon Ball. Meanwhile, by 1997, the top-shelf wrestling promotions like World Wrestling Entertainment and World Championship Wrestling (WCW) had also begun to shift away from the more cartoony style of wrestling it's commonly associated with for anti-heroes like Stone Cold Steve Austin and history's greatest masochist, Mick Foley. These performers, while fantastic character workers, also went the extra mile in the ring to sell the authenticity of their fights. With more cursing, more blood, and more steel folding chairs in the middle school cafeteria, this gave the product a much needed edge in a period the fans have taken to calling the Attitude Era. Somehow, seemingly by happenstance, there were now two juggernauts of television that appealed strongly to children, regardless of whether or not the appeal was intentional. And they were both highly character-driven works that used fighting not just as a resolution of conflict, but as a conduit for storytelling all its own. The massive story contained solely in the fight of Goku, and pretty much everyone, versus the invading planet-destroying force that was Vegeta isn't much different from the kind of stories two wrestlers can tell inside the ring. One of the best examples of this would be Bret the Hitman Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin's historical match at WrestleMania 13 in 1997. Bret represented the old school face, the guy who showed that hard work and determination would always lead to success. Austin, meanwhile, represented taking what you want and destroying those that stood in your way. After an absolute war of a match, Bret had Austin locked in his finishing move, the sharpshooter, with Austin splayed on the canvas, his face covered in crimson mask of his own blood. But instead of submitting, Austin elected to pass out, his pride not letting him concede. Bret was declared the winner, but his emotions ran high and he continued to attack his unconscious opponent. Bret Hart entered as one of the most loved wrestlers in the company and left as one of the most reviled. And Steve Austin's show of resolve propelled him to the superstardom where he would further represent WWE's new Attitude Era. Though, just by watching, you can see a lot of obvious similarities. The crazy storylines, the outlandish characters, the cartoonish level of punishment these people take. And yes, the amount you may need to suspend your disbelief to appreciate the fights. You could wonder why in anime the hero never attacks the villain while they're just monologuing, just as easily as you would wonder why wrestlers always fall for the same tricks. Why do they even bounce off the ropes when they're clearly gonna be attacked? Not to mention the fact that most wrestling promotions take the form of a perpetual decade-spanning tournament arc that never falters. Wrestling never ends. There are always new challenges to the various titles that they're held. And with new talent always coming in, the doors open for virtually endless story opportunities. After all, what wrestler doesn't want to train their abilities toward the end goal of becoming the next Tokage? I mean, becoming like no one ever was. Becoming the champion. But we can go in deeper. The convention of ridiculous fighting maneuvers having comically overblown names is nothing new to shonen, other action-heavy animes. Whether the characters on the fight or off-screen announcers let us know what technique our hero is utilizing to best decorate the far wall with the villain's face, and in a genre that places such importance on fighting, many of these signature moves come with a strong identity and history attached to them. Think Luffy's gear attacks or anything Kenshiro does in Fist of the North Star. Almost every twitch of any muscle can be traced back to its roots, from something as simple as a shoulder block to a completely ludicrous People's Elbow. The People's Elbow is also just one example of signature moves in wrestling. Virtually every wrestler is encouraged to develop a collection of moves which can be associated with their in-ring identity. Some moves like the Tombstone Pile Driver or Stone Cold Stunner became as iconic as the athletes that use it. These signature moves bring us to another important similarity between wrestling and anime. Power creep. Dragon Ball's ever-increasing number of Saiyan levels, or Izukami Midoriya's utilization of 1,000,000% of One for All, should be a familiar concept of anyone who appreciates a good shonen battle. As the story continues, there's pressure to constantly one-up the previous stakes, resulting in bigger and more powerful moves and consequences. This is also a prominent criticism of wrestling, especially in WWE. Some of the signature moves we mentioned earlier are colloquially known as finishers. At the apex of a match, one wrestler will hit their finishing move to a huge crowd reaction, which is called a pop. Whatever, it's wrestling terms. This would generally signal that the match was nearing its conclusion. The finishing move has been performed. This would be the anime equivalent of when the protagonist unleashes their final move and can tell the entire budget of the season was spent on that animation of that one attack, possibly accompanied by a declaration that this is the ultimate attack. Escaping a pin after a popular wrestler's finishing move would be regarded as a Herculean task, something only the toughest of the tough could accomplish. That's how it used to be. It's fairly common to see marquee matches absolutely littered with various signature and finishing moves, with the wrestler shrugging them off like they're nothing, essentially rendering the term finisher meaningless. This power creep is also observable in that the moves that were considered devastating finishes in the past, like Jake the Snake Roberts' DDT, have become somewhat a standard technique that newer performers use as a baseline, rather than a demonstration of 1,000,000%. Wrestling and anime are both character-driven mediums. It's no coincidence that many wrestling and anime fans will go to war with each other over who their favorite wrestler is. Or why Chika from Kaguya-sama is clearly the best girl of the season. Then when it comes to the discussion of anime itself, the stories of the most long-running animes are conveniently separated into arcs or sagas, collection of episodes that tell its own story within the greater whole of the work. And once again, since wrestling is a long-running program like most shonen anime, periods of several years and common trends in broadcast can be separated into neat eras, which serve as a great shorthand in discussions. We already mentioned the 80s Golden Age and the late 90s Attitude Era, but since then we also saw the end of the Monday Night Wars and the Ruthless Aggression Era.
What is the one quality that you possess? Ruthless aggression.
The PG era, where the WWE focused more on family-friendly content, lowering its rating to PG, as well as the reality era and the new era, which aimed to make the in-ring action more hard-hitting while also catering to the savviness of the average wrestling fan, thanks to the internet. But more than just overarching eras, in the wrestling industry, each athlete is encouraged to reinvent themselves frequently to avoid stagnating or having their careers petered out over a stale gimmick. For many, this can result in many sub-arcs of their own careers that are easily recognizable, following the career of Mean Mark Callis becoming The Undertaker, through to his Deadman phase, his Ministry of Darkness phase, his American Badass phase where he has a midlife crisis and buys a motorcycle and listens to Kid Rock and Limp Bizkit, to his various returns as his Deadman persona aren't unlike watching the growth of an anime character as they find their footing, develop, and become someone completely unrecognizable from when we first met them. Think Vegeta's transformation to a straight-up villain to a grumpy dad, or Scar in Fullmetal Alchemist, or Kurama and Hei in Yu Yu Hakusho. This idea of constant reinvention is further supplemented by wrestlers having their own theme music, which will change with their personality as time goes on.
Coming down the aisle, weighing 287 pounds, Mankind!
Not unlike how anime has certain music themes associated with each character. Or, more aptly, how anime will frequently change their opening and end credit sequences to thematically fit better with the arc that they're trying to tell us at their moment. The Undertaker is a bit of an extreme example of gimmick reinvention, but these arcs are present with every wrestler as they grow and develop into different personas as time goes by. Some even across different wrestling promotions. The last few years saw the saga of Broken Matt Hardy on Impact Wrestling and eventually a modified version of his gimmick in the WWE. This was a character so strange and yet so timeless compared to not only the rest of his wrestling scene, but to Matt Hardy's own character, which at this point had over 20 years of history. Suddenly we were shouting in a strange accent to delete his enemies, referring to his own brother Jeff as Brother Nero, His best friend was also a drone. He developed an affinity towards dilapidated boats. He and his brother demonstrated the ability to teleport. And while the character was somewhat polarizing, it was undeniably captivating. The fact that the saga of Broken, and then later, Woken Matt Hardy only made up a tiny chunk of this man's wrestling career shows that with every reinvention, a wrestler creates an arc for themselves, not unlike the narrative arcs anime form when they're adapted from a manga which they're based. This has only been a brief overview. There's so much more to wrestling than what we've covered here, not to mention all the times anime out there specifically centered around wrestling, like Ultimate Muscle, or the Tiger Mask series, which has enjoyed a real-life counterpart in New Japan Pro Wrestling since the 80s. And in 2016, the Tiger Mask W series featured a plethora of real-life New Japan talent in the anime itself, including the likes of Kenny Omega, Okada, Tanahashi, and Tetsuya Naito, among others. So yes, while both wrestling and anime have crazy costumes and completely ridiculous characters you would never believe in any other medium, hopefully we've shown just how much deeper this comparison runs than just the surface level jabs. Through the similar 80s boom of both, the execution of moves, the stories told through combat, the meta appreciation of both communities have for their favorite shows or performances, it should come as no surprise to see that there's so much overlap of wrestling fans and anime fans. Because Daniel Bryan is Deku, Triple H is Father from Full Metal, Ric Flair is Master Roshi, and wrestling is anime.